Hello, everybody. Welcome. The sun is shining right in my eyes. The setting sun. It's pretty glorious. I wonder what the camera will make of it. I don't know the etymological origins of the word glory, though I have an unusual skill with understanding letters and words. I'm thinking today about a couple of topics that are the remnants of a long conversation I had with a friend last night. And I guess there's a connecting element underneath the conversation, which is the character of what's going on in a general sense, right? What's going on Earth? What's the nature of the epoch? What's the character of our time? Underneath all of the accoutrements that our modern lives and societies pile on top of life. So what's the real essential spirit of the moment? What's the weather in between all the beings? My friend Ryan the other day, as we were speaking on the phone, saw outside his window an incredibly pregnant deer, and he was shocked because that's not supposed to happen yet. In terms of the way we think about the progression of the phenological seasons, meaning the relationships between plants, animals, insects, humans, living beings. Right now there's a bumblebee circling my head because of the color of my hat. Now that word "because" is highly suspect, but surely the color of my hat has something to do with this circling. And I have seen that the raptors, the owls and the hawks, and eagles, but we don't usually have eagles where I live. They've been unusually frisky, when generally they won't mate until the next moon cycle, but apparently some of them appear to be either getting ready very early or actually mating in this moon cycle. And so in an echo of one interpretation of a Shakespearean line, time is out of joint. And any of us who are sensitive at all have been aware of this for some time and have been trying to understand it and pay attention to it. And of course, on the surface of things in the human world, we have what we're referring to as the pandemic. Of course, it's not the pandemic, it's a pandemic. And there are different kinds of pandemics, and some of them probably rise and pass without the extended population even having a chance to notice them, because they do no significant harm, or they resemble things like colds or flu. So surely there are invisible pandemics, but there are different kinds of pandemics as well. There are pandemics of greed, of war, of peace, of consumerism, of environmental devastation, all kinds of different pandemics. There are pandemics of birth and death. There are pandemics of weather of a certain kind. And some of these things become endemic, right? They become sort of constant features of our day-to-day lives. And there are a lot of features of the changes that have been coming for quite some time, but maybe have only emerged into relatively severe examples somewhat recently. Many people have been aware for 20, 30, 40 years that our human societies and their catastrophic reliance on the production of objects and the dissemination of objects and the creation of toxins and trash and heat are destroying the basis of the environment, the fundamental aspects of the environment. So many of us have been aware for a long time of these things, and yet, nonetheless, something has fundamentally shifted in a foundational way over, say, the last 5 years. And a number of my friends have reported a peculiar problem that precedes the pandemic significantly, and I am aware of the problem myself. A sudden feeling of loss of the fundamental sense of purpose, and a deep and abiding concern about what this could mean and what the source of it is. Now, of course, it's important to remember that there are billions of humans and everyone's having a unique experience of being alive in this time. And not everyone is experiencing the same thing, but many of the more sensitive people that I know, and many of the more dynamic people that I know, and perhaps also some of the more delicate, in some ways, people that I know, they are reporting the same thing, and they have been for quite some time. Long before, 2020. This felt sense of a terrible loss, of the fundamental light inside our sense of time and being, from which we derive our sense of purposiveness, that there's a reason, that's the wrong word, that there's an urgency deep within us that draws us into daily life and planning for the future and responding to the situations at hand, and creativity and self-expression, self-development, and so on. And this is a very deep shockwave, almost as if there's been an earthquake, right? And it rumbled for a while, and then great stillness came. And one of my friends remarked around in late 2018, he said, a very sober kind of guy, he said, when I asked him, what happened and such, he said, well, I had a sense of impending doom, and then suddenly I could no longer feel the future. And I asked him, sometime later, well, did it ever come back? And he said, no, it didn't. And of course, we do have a sense that feels the past and the future. We don't have a word for this sense. There is the German word Zeitgeist, which means approximately time spirit, or spirit of the time. But we have faculties that sense these things. We just don't have language, and we don't talk about them together. So if there were a sudden disturbance in the underlying nature, the felt sense of human purposiveness and time, if there were a sudden shock wave or a change there, how would we know, since we don't discuss such things together? We would not know, yeah? And even if someone tried to explain it to us, it's not part of our common vocabulary of sensing. So we might think, oh, well, this is a uniquely sensitive person. They're just having their own, sensitive experience. Doesn't take much sensitivity to notice that. A moment ago, when I was talking about the raptors being very frisky and flamboyant, this is what I'm talking about. Yeah. Now, I have a tiny, tiny audience for my videos. Maybe 10 or 15 people at most, and a few stragglers. So nearly no one will hear my reflections on these topics, at least not today or soon. The initial sense of this loss in my friends and myself was so shocking that some of us thought, oh, I'm going to die, right? I can't live like this without that inner motivation and light that comes from the subtle sense and connection with purposive existence. It was as if a star inside us that had never not been shining suddenly completely disappeared. Certainly we've experienced little eclipses and things, but nothing like this. And so for many of us, it is a devastating experience, and we have no one to talk about it with, and no vocabulary to speak about it with. It's unfamiliar to us. We've never experienced it before. People who have experienced Great Depression may have some familiarity with this problem, where one wakes up and from sleep at night and there's no desire to do anything. One does not want to eat or do one's daily routine or work or anything. And many of us have heard that varying country by country, place by place, time by time, there are huge populations of people who, quote, do not wish to return to work, unquote. What could such a thing mean? It seems impossible. Everybody pretty much works, right? And there are a lot of health problems that aren't related directly to the pandemic. Psychological health problems, emotional health problems, relational health problems, financial problems, that millions of people are suddenly facing. And we think that humans communicate primarily with a webwork of known sources of verbal and visual information. And we think that's the primary layer of the network that connects all humans. It's not. There's a subtle layer that I call the cognitium. This is like the mind of the species at the moment. An anciently evolved network with many unique faculties and potentials and capabilities that the internet is sort of a wrapping paper version of. The cognitium for the humans, and there is the biocognitium, there's the cognitium of all life on Earth, from which the human cognitium emerges, yes. The human cognitium has undergone a staggering cascade of transformations over the past 20 years. And of course, it's always transforming. But the specific character of the transformations we are in now is extremely troubling and grim. And part of it is a result of the attempt to replace the subtle network with a physical network that we call the internet. Or at least that's a causal factor in what's going on. So a friend of mine and I were speaking last night about these problems. What do we do when I can't feel any purpose? And my motivation has disappeared. And we talked about the meaning of the word motivation. And I posed it as an opposite to gravity. Or to the kind of low-hanging fruit of superficial rewards or gratifications, yeah. And we also talked about, various other features of this situation, some of which I may get to touch on in the video. But the difference between something deep and richly developed in say, a relationship and immediate gratification. This pair, they are preparing to mate, and may have already been mating. Interesting synchronicity there. So when our motivation disappears and we are lost and we are directionless and our inner compass doesn't work and doesn't lead us anywhere familiar, doesn't really point anywhere, we hold the compass and can't find north or south, right? The most intense signal or the least intense signal. We can't find our way. Then we are inclined to become hungry for some kind of stimulation, and so we become more vulnerable to problematic behavior, addictions, superficial gratification, drugs, all of what we would encompass with the idea of vices, yeah. Gambling, financial gain, addiction, overeating, lethargy, binging on things. We don't want to step forth, or it's not that we don't want to. The inward felt sense that draws us into life, that draws us into development and seeking is missing, yeah? So what we want is anything else we can get that sort of resembles that even for a moment, or kind of puts us to sleep and comforts us so that we can wait, we can await the hopeful reawakening of purposive senses and motivation. And so what I mean by gravity is that other kinds of gratifications acquire gravity in this time. And these can be ideological gratifications. Oh, I know what the problem is. It's those people over there and these people over here. And I know what's wrong with how they think, and the whole sort of low-grade disease of modern cultural blah blah blah, right? Which includes arguments about the virus and science and medicine and vaccines and mandates and all these things. Shattering the people apart, right? Close friends won't speak to each other because one of them is vaccinated and the other one isn't. I've heard people say terrifying things, emotionally terrifying things that are definitely wrong about such stuff. Oh, I hope this happens to them, this terrible thing happens to them because either they are vaccinated or not vaccinated. Look, something terrible is happening to all of us. And at the same time, something beautiful is happening to all of us. If we can learn together to turn our senses, right, so that we sense what is subtle rather than what has long been overt. There's the analogy of day and night. By day, we look at things and know pretty much immediately what they are, even though there's some pareidolia involved even in daytime visual sensing. If I see a little shadow off to the side, I may immediately think, oh, that's a person, and then find out, no, it's a piece of fabric flapping in the wind. Pareidolia is the sense that precedes the distinct sensing. It's vague and transforming, but in the daytime, outside in the sunlight, when it's bright, identity is relatively declared by the nature of the light and our visual senses, presuming that we are sighted people. So I know that's a tree, that's a log, that's a rock, this is a fork, that is my beloved, this is the sun, that is the sky, this is bark, grass, sage plant, artemisia, and so on. And along with the relatively clear declaration of identity comes the relatively clear derivation both of purpose and avoidance, right? What should I stay away from and what should I go toward? It's easy to go toward what we can clearly discern in the daytime. It's easy to go away from threats we can clearly discern in the daytime, mostly. But at nighttime, something very different happens, and the dimension of color, look at all those colors, yeah. The dimension of color largely disappears, especially if it's quite dark. And now things are much more vague, yeah. Identity is suggested rather than declared. The colors toned down to shades of gray and black. And so sensing at night is a very different experience. And these two polarities of visual sensing resemble something that's happening inside us with waking mind and dreaming mind and sleep. So at nightfall, one way to think about what's been going on is the sun has been setting, the purposive sun has been setting inside our people. And we are not used to darkness in the inward, essential sense of purposiveness. So we're all very frightened and we don't know what to do. Um, in my house, if it's very dark, sometimes I don't turn on the lights. And I can find most of the things in my house without turning on the lights because I'm very familiar with the inside of my house. So I could find my reading glasses, even though that would be a strange thing to do in the dark. So one of the things I am suggesting is that we recognize that there's been a nightfall and it's progressing. It's not just dark for many people in their inward experience of purpose and the future. It may be black, just completely without any sort of, any other, just the most primordial, simple motivations. I will eat food, or, I will watch the show, or, And as we struggle in the current situation, as mysterious and profound as it is, and as different as it is for different people and age groups, right? It's helpful to at least have some way of talking about it together, and to talk about it together, right? If you're having a sudden lack of feeling of purpose or motivation, let's talk about this together with people that we trust and love. Yeah? Not so that we can be diagnosed, though some of us, that might be a reasonable outcome for some of us, but no, so that we can share together and try to understand, hey, are you having a problem like this too? Do you feel something like this too? How is it for you to be feeling this kind of thing? At this time. How is it for your mother? How is it for your brother or sister? How is it for your neighbor? We can share and help each other to learn what is happening, or to learn more about what is happening and how we might respond together and support each other in what is happening. Often, if we lose purpose locally, we might try to acquire it through another. Yeah? So we might become very concerned or interested in or ready to pursue a love relationship, for example. And we might think, well, if I just had a love relationship, that would help me be motivated. It's not entirely confused. Yeah? But first we should recognize the inward situation and become very intimate with the inward situation in our hearts, in our essence, in our humanity, in our animal nature, in our cognition, in our creativity, in our daily routines. When things are changing, it is wise to seek intimacy with the change. Right? If we simply resist it, it's not always only bad, but we will not become more sensitive. And we may likely end up kind of falling asleep or into a trance-like state, yeah, within the situation, which can be very dangerous in a time of great challenge or trouble. And surely our time is such a time. We need, in the darkest moments, we need the very best of ourselves. And this is often conflict, right? Because in the darkest moments, what we would like, many of us, some of the time, is to just stand back and let the disaster happen, Wait for it to be over with. But this is a time when we may feel it. There are other aspects of purposive behavior and sensing, and some of those are catalyzed by trouble and darkness. Yeah? So that in the trouble and darkness, if we are sensitive and aware, new branches on the tree of purpose are sprouting, and these are branches that may involve mutual care and concern, mutual caretaking, mutual awareness, moving beyond the self into the community, however small or vast we may experience it as being. And being gentle and kind to one another and to ourselves, and stepping down from the judgment and outrage and, hullabaloo of the news and social media and things that actually are very trivial and meaningless in most of their expressions. Now, of course, for some of us, finding a lover or a companion during this time could be very powerful and comforting. I'm not saying what we should or should not do, but we should, I think, it would be helpful to be aware that some of that longing that we may feel for closeness with a companion is the result of having lost intimacy with ourselves. Because part of how we are intimate with ourselves is through motivation and purpose. Now, the idea of gravity comes from a word meaning filled with eggs, like fertile. But it also has something to do with memory. Gravity. And in a sense, gravity is a concretion. It's a consequence of concretions, right? Like the moon and the earth. And motivation is kind of you can pose motivation as one of the polarities in the continuum of gravity and motivation. We work against gravity to stand up, right? We are motivated to rise. Or at least it can be thought of in this way. I'm not trying to say what is true, but the analogy is interesting. When we lose motivation, the gravity of immediate gratifications emerges powerfully to our awareness, and we may respond to that. Also, if we are losing a sense, it is helpful to have another with us who can sense, so that we can share senses. We forget that our minds are different things when we are alone than they are when we are deeply together with others in meaningful ways and roles. Right? Our minds and bodies transform; they actually change state. So, in a real way, I am not the same thing when I am with my friend, and we are talking or relating deeply with one another, or I am with my lover and we are relating deeply with one another. And of course, one of my lovers is the living world and all of the living beings. That's my main lover. So I change when I enter the garden, and the old conversation is renewed. It's important to understand that our limitations can disappear or transform when we forge a deep bond with another, even momentarily. Think of the last time the smile of a stranger lit your heart, or the last time both your hearts lit up when you passed someone on the street and just smiled meaningfully and deeply to one another for a moment without speaking anything. Yeah. No words required. Think about how powerful that transformation is, even though it may be momentary. We are used to sort of a continuous sense of motivation. When the continuous sense departs, the momentary sense becomes very valuable. Yeah? So even things that we can do to produce a momentary spark can be precious. Now, I'll probably talk in a coming video of the next topic, but it's somewhat related. It is that in our modern societies, we've largely inverted the virtues of chastity, generosity, kindness, temperance, sobriety, attending that which is important, purposive, deep purposive practice, leaving aside the superficial and immediate gratifications, honesty, integrity, respect, love, intelligence, insight, creativity, all these virtues. Some of them are still alive in us and our people, but by and large, at the population level, we succumb to the low-hanging fruit of immediate gratification or entrancement or distraction, consumption. And when we do this, we're injuring our faculties, because we have many faculties, hundreds of them, that only develop in the context of virtue. And so, for example, young people or sometimes older people may meet and there's a spark between them, so they immediately have sex. Yeah. And that's very compelling experience. It's very powerful, overwhelming. Cuts right through, everything else in a way. But there are couples who meet and they have the same intensity and the same spark of mutual interest and fascination, but not only do they not have sex, they don't touch. And they may meet every day, and this could go on for a year or more, and they don't go for the low-hanging fruit of, immediate gratification. And in a context like this, new faculties develop, and depths of bonds, forms of bonds, and depths of those forms develop that are otherwise not only unimaginable, but impossible. So I encourage my listeners to consider these matters and understand that the idea of fasting, which is a very profound practice, can be employed in various domains of our lives to build a certain kind of intelligent resistance to immediate gratification. And this will almost always be rewarding, because it will allow the development of feelings, faculties, and abilities that otherwise languish or never sprout, right? They just remain in the seed form within us. Perhaps I will speak more of that in a future video. Thank you for joining me. May your path be beautiful and blessed. Bye-bye for now. There's the sunset glory